Okay. Let's see. I don't see you. For tonight, as you know, we're going to do a storytelling workshop. So we'll get started in just a moment. How we'll proceed is I'll introduce our panelists, and each panelist will speak for 8 to 10 minutes about how they use stories and storytelling in their work, in their life, in their cultural doings. And maybe there'll be time too in those presentations for panelists to talk about their own pandemic stories they've heard. And then we'll have time for some Q&A. So this session is scheduled to go from 5:30 to 7. And we're really looking forward to that. I think during our breakout sessions, we'll do when just the courses break out and the panelists don't need to join us, of course. But during breakout sessions, we'll do class announcements and things like that. So if you want to hold those questions until then. But I do encourage you all, students and community members alike, to jot down your questions for our panelists. I think we're going to learn a lot of interesting things about what stories mean for our lives, and what stories mean for us as human beings. So jot down your questions as we go forward there. So this event is being streamed live on Facebook Live. So if you are a subscriber to the College of Arts and Letters Facebook page, you will be able to access this event. So, all right. And it would be great if bandwidth allows for you to log on so we can say hello as we begin. Go ahead and turn on your videos as we begin. It'd be great to see you. Thanks. All right, let's go ahead and begin. As you know, students and panelists, and if you're a community member joining us, thank you very much. I'll introduce myself briefly. I'm Joya Woods. I'm Professor of Humanities in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies, and I'm one of the 3 teachers of this special class called the Plague Project. And one of the things we're doing in this class is students are required to write their own pandemic stories, their experiences with COVID-19, with quarantine and lockdown, and then they are required to interview others about their pandemic experiences and put the 2 narratives together. And we're working closely with Sam Meyer, who's an archivist here at Klein Library. And Sam is helping us archive those stories in Klein's special collections. So there'll be a really nifty historical record of how Northern Arizonans dealt with this, with COVID-19, all the attendant challenges, the bane and enlightenment of COVID-19, as Camus says. So stories for future generations. So we're really, really grateful to Sam and her work. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. So I'm going to just always go alphabetically, and I'll introduce each alphabetically, and then I'll ask each to launch into their presentation in order. Okay? So if you are not speaking, please do mute your mic. Thank you. All right, so very briefly, this is Mike Amundson. He is a professor of history here at Northern Arizona University. His focus is mainly US history, and he's also a public historian. So he's very mindful of how we make history and history makes us, particularly in the public sphere, how history is useful to us as citizens and as humans. Then I'd like for you to welcome Lorenzo Max. Mr. Max is a Navajo traditional practitioner and medicine man. And then I'd like for you to say hello to Sam Meyer. Many of you have met her previously. She is an archivist for Discovery at Klein Special Collections and Archives. And then finally, Melissa Sivany, who is a science reporter at KNAU. And KNAU, of course, is the local, is Northern Arizona's NPR station. And Melissa is also the author of 2 books on science. So, without further ado, we're going to begin. Each panelist will speak for 8 to 10 minutes. All of you in the audience, please jot down your questions so we can have a good, robust discussion afterwards. And it truly is our contention, my contention for sure, that it is stories that make us human and stories that enable us to express our humanity to one another. So I'm excited to hear from these 4 different panelists about what stories mean to them. So Dr. Amundson, if you would begin, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I should tell everybody that the thing about Joya and I is that we share a cat.
Yes,
we have a cat that wanders back and forth from her house to our house and sleeps on my bed half the time. I don't know where it sleeps at your house, but it sleeps in my spot at home. So
yes, we share a cat. It is an unusual relationship. Yes,
we do. I have a PowerPoint. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. So let's see if you guys can see my PowerPoint here. Can you see my slides?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
There we go. We're good?
Yes,
yeah. We're good.
Okay. I always have to ask. So this kind of stories I tell, I'm a historian of the American West, and I write about one of the great things about being a historian is that you can do whatever you want to do as long as you're doing something. And so I've written a number of books, and I've written about atomic culture. I wrote a book about uranium mining and another book that's sort of about popular culture. I've done a lot of work about photography and how we can interpret photographs in the landscape. And this is going back to work that I did as an undergraduate, where I took turn of the century photographs and then photographed them again, and then went back 20 years after that to photograph them one more time. I've written a book about cowboy and Indian songs on wind-up Edison phonographs before the invention of radio. I've written a number of articles, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of these here in a few minutes. One about the Grand Canyon and uranium mining, one about polo in Wyoming, the elite sport, another that looked at Arizona and Mars, and how we thought about each of them in terms of irrigation. And the last one that I started on actually is a class project with my class. It was on the history of elk in Arizona. And you're going to be learning a little bit about elk. And I think how I talk about elk will inform you a little bit about pandemics and how we think about how historians do the work. And as I say that, I can hear Oscar knocking on my front door. So here were the kinds of questions that Joya asked us, and you can see those. And I will tell you that historians amalgamate smaller stories into larger ones. We take lots of little stories and try to put them together and make sense out of them into bigger ones. We work to reconstruct the past to tell us what happened, but we also work to explain why the past is important. And the question I ask my students all the time, that's really great, but so what? What is important about that? To recreate this, historians engage with several kinds of sources. One are primary sources, and those are sources from the period at hand, which include diaries, newspapers, eyewitness accounts, records, speeches, all those kinds of things, as well as creative works like photographs and paintings and music and landscapes. And those things all tell us about what happened, okay? We also engage secondhand sources, secondhand items by people who did not experience but have thought about earlier events. These could be books or scholarly articles, encyclopedia entries, theoretical pieces, and they help us to understand why things are important. And so it's about what happened and why it's important. I'm going to try to work my way through an article that I wrote to sort of tell you a little bit about how I've done this in the past. And I think maybe some thoughts about some of this will emanate with you thinking about the pandemic. So I wrote this article that just came out this summer about the history of Arizona's elk. And what I learned from this was that we had a native species of elk, the Merriam's elk, and it was exterminated about 1901. We then reintroduced elk here in 1913 from Yellowstone National Park. And so this was sort of two stories in one. Now, to start this process as a historian, the first thing I did was to go read up on elk. What could I find out about from published sources about elk? And so I read histories of elk and photo books about elk, and then this book about game management in Arizona, which is a very odd topic, but it's all about sort of how we manage these things. I learned some things, but I didn't learn enough, and so I turned to primary sources to add to that. And so I found newspaper stories. I went on newspapers.com and chroniclingamerica.gov, and I looked up elk and all stories about Arizona, and I found about 40 different stories about Arizona elk between 1867 and 1899. So some of them were before Flagstaff was even here. And so I found, but these are not big. These are just little mentions, like elk being found by Bill Williams Mountain, or a few elk remain in the southern part of in northern Arizona, but not in the southern part. Or here's one from 1896, elk have all been exterminated in this country. And so these are not long stories, but little blips of information that I could use to sort of put together a narrative. I then turned to the relocation of elk in Arizona. And again, I looked at secondary sources. What does it tell me about game management? And so I read about Arizona history. And I had to read about Yellowstone to see why there was a surplus of elk in Yellowstone. And I also learned that the Elks Lodge, of all things, is what brought the elks to Arizona. And so I had to learn about the Elks Lodge. And this reading is not nearly as fascinating as you might think. It's actually quite boring. Okay, but that's what it taught me about that. And as I learned that this really had to do with Governor George W.P. Hunt, who was the governor in 1913, and this Prescott doctor, Robert Looney.
Surgery.
Sorry?
You look like you're going into surgery.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Robert Looney was the guy who organized it. And I found this wonderful set of collections at the Arizona Memory Project called the Correspondence Concerning the Elk. And it was 55 letters from 1912 to 1913 between Looney, Hunt, biologists, Yellowstone people, Elks Lodge members, and others. It included the original letter that he wrote to the governor talking about it, the governor's 1912 reply, a receipt from Yellowstone National Park saying we've captured 80 elk and are sending them to you. And then a 1914 itemized statement showing how much each Elks Lodge in Arizona contributed to the project, as well as a lot of other letters from Boone and Crockett Club members and all kinds of people. I also found a mention to an Outdoor Life magazine story from 1912 about trapping and shipping elk. And I found that story and was able to pull that in. I then looked at newspapers, and I was overwhelmed by the number of newspapers. Here are 61 articles between 1905 and 1914 about bringing elk back to Arizona. These were a little longer. Here's one from the Flagstaff paper. Here's one from a Sheridan, Wyoming newspaper talking about people going down and looking at the railroad car full of elk bound for Arizona. And then here's the Winslow newspaper when they arrived. Arrival of elk sets town agog. And I was just fascinated by all of this local history. And I found out that they then took them 50 miles south to the White Mountains. And here's a postcard from 1913 showing the elk in Winslow. And then the backside of that, and an oral history about how they took them and how they shipped them the last 50 miles. So I basically had all the what happened in place. And I began writing narratives of the extermination and the reintroduction. But then I began to contextualize this, put this into the so what question. How does this shape game management? What does it tell about state politics? I also looked at books outside of Arizona and outside of elk management that talk to me about hybrid landscapes. And hybrid landscapes are these places that are not natural, but not artificial, and it's sort of a mixture between the two, like when you reintroduce a species that shouldn't be there. And also this idea of imperialist nostalgia, which is this longing for something you've had a hand in destroying, a longing for something you've had a hand in destroying, which is why we brought elk back, I think. I presented my work at the Arizona History Convention. I revised it. I took it from a 10-page class paper to a 15-page paper, eventually to a 39-page article. And so I kept adding and adding to it. And I sent it off to the Journal of Arizona History. They wrote back and said, we really like it, but you need to look at animal history and how it grapples with forced migrations. They told me to read a chapter in a book about migrant muskox. And I tell students all the time, now you're going to read stuff that has nothing to do with your topic, but it might inform the context. And so I found this book, The Historical Animal. And I read about the muskox. And I thought, okay, what was this like from the elk's perspective? How could I write a story from the perspective of the elk? And if you know anything about Arizona history, one of the first things that came to mind for me when I saw this picture and thought about forced migrations was the 1918 deportation from Bisbee, in which they took workers that they thought were communists and loaded them into boxcars and sent them away. And I thought there's an interesting connection here between those two things. We never know quite how all of this is going to work out. As I was writing this, it took me 3 years to put this all together. In January 2018, the Arizona Game and Fish captured 60 Arizona elk and shipped them to West Virginia, where they sort of remigrated the grandchildren of the first elk, or the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the first elk. And that was another story that I was able to bring into my own story, which brought it to a timely, firsthand, present account. And so when I start my article, my final story, I start with the January 2018 reintroduction into West Virginia. And so I hope from all of this, I've tried to talk very quickly, but I'm just at 10 minutes, is to sort of see how historians do our work and to get a sense of both primary and secondary sources. Done.
That's great, Mike. That is fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
Great, great. Let's hold questions till the end. So we'll move on to Lorenzo Max now. So Mr. Max, if you want to turn on your screen and unmute yourself, we are ready for you.
Okay, let me figure this out here.
We can hear you.
This is all new to me, so bear with me.
No problem.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody, faculty, students, and that was a beautiful presentation. I love the pictures and the stories. However, in my culture, being a Navajo, our ancestors didn't have a written language. So, but they still needed to record sacred and important events in some fashion. And how our ancestors did that was they recorded them in songs. Songs, also in sand paintings, our artwork, our basket. We have a Navajo wedding basket. You know, the Navajo people, we only have one basket design, whereas all the other tribes around us have many, many different types of design, but we only have one. Why is that? Well, it tells a story. It's kind of like a story of our past, of our history. And you can literally do practically almost a semester of lecture on just the basket alone, because it holds so many stories. And the significance that pertain to them. So, and then our history is also recorded in our ceremonies. And so our songs are like book our songs and important.
Oh wait, then I'm not showing my, like I'm not showing my hand. Because I ended it, so she'd be February way and I ended it.
To carry on certain songs, and you can have a reservation when they sing. So there's, put into the songs and its entirety. And that's unfortunate because of history. So the story prayers and artworks and paintings are important because it tells you who you are. The original instructions that were given to mankind, that's what it tells us. Our social norms, our clanship, our relationship. At one time, the Navajo people valued relationship above all other things. Materialistic things were not really valued. It was the relationship. And the relationship between each other, the relationship between us and nature, that was very important. So it holds value to us. So our worldview is not really the same as other people's, other culture. But our worldview is very similar to most indigenous people all over the world. So and it's almost like we are one with nature, and the songs and things like that, the stories contained in it, tells us about the universe, the order of the universe, the natural order, and how we're connected to it, and connected to the cosmic mind. So there's a lot of things I can say about these, but time is limited. The songs also are used to rebalance ourselves, to reconnect to some part of nature, because a lot of the illness that we know comes from a person getting out of balance with some part of nature. So we use the songs to reconnect, reground ourselves. So, and therefore there's healing in it. So our songs, stories, and things like that are actually our first healthcare system. It was used to, healing for the spirit, your emotion, healing for the physical body, and healing at a spiritual level. So that's how we view the songs. And we end our songs by saying, this is what they said. All the songs that we have, they all end pretty much the same way. We end our songs by saying, hey, ya, kola ane. Kola ane means this is what they said, meaning that this is what our ancestors said. So in every song, we always give credit to where it comes from. And we always give credit to Mother Earth and Father Sky. At the beginning of our songs, we say, that means Mother Earth, being thankful, to Mother Earth. Yang means, Father Sky, being thankful and acknowledging Mother Earth and Father Sky. So when we're singing, we're just not mumbling. Every word, every syllable has a meaning. And it's always our connection to each other, to the natural universe, and so on and so forth. And I'll give you an example of a story. Nobody really knew how old my grandfather was. But one day I asked him, I said, "Grandfather, how old are you?" Instead of telling me by giving me a number, he told me a story. He says, a long time ago, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, there was a pandemic that came across our land. People were having a hard time breathing. getting sick, and some of them are dying. We didn't know what it was. So we did inquiries. Inquiries meaning that, we have the ability to use what we call tinle to check a person's personal energy field or aura, to check for what type of energy or present in that person's aura. So by doing that, they were able to isolate an energy field that they were not familiar with, but it had ties to that, in our songs. And there was 4 songs there that talks about that energy, that virus or bacteria or things like that, those type of energies. So once they figured that out, they were able to go out into the nature and make medicine, and they did that, and they were able to cure themselves with it. They drank the medicine. They also boiled it to breathe in the hot vapor, deep into their lungs, and the people that couldn't breathe could breathe again. So, and then the second time it came around, he said, but that second time it didn't really affect us all that much because we knew what it was by that time. So that, of course, he was talking about the Spanish flu of 1918. We lost my grandfather a year ago. And so he probably lived, if he was that old, around that time, he probably was about 108 or 109 years old. So we're talking about 112 years ago. So that pandemic, to my understanding, they say it has killed 50 to 100 million people all over the world. And it had the potential of, killing off, people, the Navajo people and other indigenous people. But for some reason it didn't. I think it's because of how they were able to keep records, and they were able to, use that to survive. So, back then, 102 years ago, we didn't have hand sanitizers. We didn't have, our ancestors didn't have running water so they can wash their hand every few minutes. They had no face masks, no social distancing, no CDC guidelines. And of course, probably no hospitals, because right now, even in this day and age, the hospitals on the Navajo reservation is kind of like subpar. It's not as good as the hospital in Flagstaff. So imagine 102 years ago, it was probably very, very primitive. Maybe just one doctor and a couple of nurses, that's it. So in a tiny house or something. So even with that, no lockdown, no curfew, our people did okay. They were able to survive. But now let's take it compared to what's going on today. On the Navajo Nation, we still have the close kinship. We still have people living in one house like we did 102 years ago. The family structure really hasn't changed. It's still the same. And now we have hand sanitizers, we have face masks, we have running water, we have hospitals that are modern with what do you call that, the thing that they put on your face to breathe, incubators and things like that. Yeah. So we have all those, and then we have the shutdowns and the curfew, and so we have all kinds of resources, but still we as far as per capita infection is concerned, the Navajo Nation kind of reached at the top of the spectrum in terms of infections. Even in comparison to New York, we surpassed New York. We probably surpass, almost everybody else around the world, And why is that? Why is it that our ancestors didn't really have it, too much of a problem, and they were able to survive and be able to overcome and control, 102 years ago versus now? Well, I think the difference is, they didn't, a lot of these songs are gone. A lot of these instructions on how to make that medicine is gone. So that's the difference. Now, my grandfather told me how to make that medicine. I was able to make some for people, and they were able to, get well, and some of them didn't even get infected. For instance, my niece, my sister's oldest daughter, she has 3 kids, and her husband is non-Navajo. Her husband got infected, and beforehand, this was back in mid-May or early May. I made medicine for them, and they live down in Phoenix. And I told them to start drinking that medicine, that herb. And of course, the husband didn't want to drink it because, being non-Navajo, didn't believe in these type of things. So, and he got COVID-19. He tested positive. He came home from work, and the next day he wasn't feeling too good, but he still went to work, and then he got seriously sick at work, and my niece had to haul him back home. And she gave me a call, and she says, this is what happened. I said, well, you're exposed. Don't go to any of your relatives, your friends' house. You just need to stay put and continue drinking that medicine. You're just going to have to ride it out. Get yourself tested, and just check in with me every now and then. And that's what they did. So they live in a 2 small bedroom apartment in Phoenix, and throughout the whole duration, her husband being infected, she and the 3 kids did not get infected. Even though they were tested from time to time, they were consistently negative. So, we had a hot summer in Phoenix, 115 all the way to 118 sometimes. And air conditioners running all day long and all night long, and they're breathing the same air, and why is it that they didn't get, infected? The only thing that they were doing different was, besides, using sanitizer and face masks and all that kind of stuff, the only thing they were different was they were using the herbs that were mentioned in our songs. So, and then I have other stories that, that I have experienced, and I've heard from other medicine people how they were able to, help other people, in other parts of the reservation. But the thing about it is, this is only an isolated, case. Like in the Western Navajo, there's probably not too many people that know the herbs that my grandfather told me to make. And so the knowledge is, pretty much dying off. So, and I don't know, if our ancestors were able to record history by writing it down, then over time, our initial instructions on how we're supposed to be as humans will begin to change. Like the animals in the wild, the elks, they live according to their initial instructions. We don't have to take care of them. We don't really have to tell them when to mate, how they live, and what they eat. It's still the same. It's just that sometimes we human, we begin to exterminate them, but within their own environment, they don't need no supervision. We don't need to do ceremonies for them. We don't need to make medicine for them. They live according to their original instruction on what was given to them, and they only have one voice. But for us human, we have many voices, but we begin to wander off our initial instructions. because we put our own personal opinion into some of the things that we live by. So gradually things begin to change. But we cannot do that to our songs. We cannot put our own opinion into any of our songs. It's not allowed. And, it's got to be uttered, the same way. And it's handed down from generation to generation. My grandfather got after me if I just tweak a song just a little bit. They'll stop me, even though there's a lot of people listening, and say, wait a minute, it's not right there. And I'm sitting there, that's so minute, it doesn't even matter. It's just like 99%, but they still, were upset about that 1% that was off. So that's how we were taught, throughout the years, and I've been learning these ever since I was a young boy. So it takes a lifetime to master, certain areas. I've mastered working with energy, the bad energy, the energy that we call hochung, and then the good energy that we call huizhou. How to move the hochung energy away from a person, so you can put the good energy of huizhou back onto a person. So, and I'm still working, fine tuning, and every now and then I run across something a little bit different. So, so it's not something that, somebody can learn overnight. So, so I'll just go ahead and leave that. Maybe I went over my time here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Max. Thank you so much. And hopefully you can stick around for the other two, and then and do some questions with us in a few minutes. Thank you very much for sharing your time. Next, we have Samantha Meyer.
Hello.
Who is our client archivist of Discovery.
Of Discovery, yes.
Ahead,
that part's very important to me. So I actually became, most of the students in this class have met me already, but for you others, I became an archivist, and I'm a very young archivist, I want to say, actually because of my experiences as a researcher. So a couple of students were asking Dr. Amundson how he organized all of the materials he gathered, and that's why I went to library school, because I had begun this project that I started my senior year of college. It was an interview-based research project in which I interviewed a number of women who had been involved with these feminist comic books in the 1970s and 1980s. And then I wrote a very long paper about it. But after doing that, I got a grant to actually go and visit some of these women in mostly California where they lived. And then they started giving me stuff. So they would give me copies of their correspondence. They would give me copies of their comics. They would show me fanzines. They would show me photographs and provide access for me to all these materials that filled in the parts of their stories that I hadn't heard about when I was interviewing them, that showed them when they were young, that showed what their artwork looked like. And so based on that experience, I started doing archival research and historical research at a number of different institutions around the country. I think I traveled to around 13, ranging from the Library of Congress to the Lesbian Her Story Archives, trying to find other documentation of these women at different points in their lives and what they were doing. And then I just wound up with a bunch of copies of stuff that I had made, and I had no idea what to do with it. So I went and became an archivist to figure out what you do with all of these little pieces of a story that Dr. Amundson was talking about. And what archivists try to do is really two things. We try to preserve every instance of a story, so every photograph, every letter. I was thinking as Mr. Max was speaking about my time at the Library of Congress, in which I got to be present for an unveiling of a project called Ancestral Voices, which is a digital repatriation project in which in the late 1800s, an ethnographer named Jesse Fox had made recordings that were made improperly at the time of tribal members of the Passamaquoddy tribe singing traditional songs. And then he captured them on these wax cylinders. That was the only technology available at the time. And over time, the American Folklife Center there has tried to do different things to return that knowledge that was improperly taken and subsequently suppressed or lost to the communities from which it originated. And so I got to be present at this event, which I'll drop a link in the chat later, in which a singer from Passamaquoddy performed a song that he said had not been heard by members of his tribe since the late 1890s when it was captured. So no one had heard it since 128 years previously. And so when archivists do our job well, we help carry those little fragments of every story into the future. But the other thing that archivists do that I want to acknowledge is that we have to represent those materials to people so they can find and use them, which is the discovery part of my job. And generally what that means is that we have to use text, we have to use language to describe these rich resources that can be very, very extensive. You could be looking at thousands of photographs and you need to be able to provide a couple of paragraphs that says, this is what everything is about. You know, this is what these photographs show. These are the people or the places or whatever it is. And so your work is always trying to think about, well, how do I quickly convey to a whole variety of researchers what this stuff is about so that they can find and use it. If they're looking for information about elk, they know that this relates to elk. Or if they're looking for other kinds of stories, they know that this material is pertinent to what they're interested in. And I will say that archivists don't always get that right, in part because we don't always know what people are going to want to know about the past, and in part because interests change. So just to give you one example, today I was working on a collection, which is an ethnographic collection related to work done by two white anthropologists on the Navajo Nation in the 1940s. And it turns out that after they were in New Mexico living with a Navajo family, which is what most of the collection material reflects these experiences they had, they actually went to a Japanese American internment camp in Boston. And one of the anthropologists there was contracted to start up a research lab there. And so he spent, I believe, 18 months in Boston at the relocation center there. And we have maybe 20 photos that initially, when the archivist who processed these photos back in the 90s, in 1995, looked at them, he didn't know what to make of them because all the other photos were of, you know, Navajo families weaving, they were of these anthropologists, they were totally different kinds of images. And then there were about 20 photos of Japanese American people. And so they're just labeled Japanese visitors, but by doing a little bit of research in the collection and figuring out what these were, I'm 95% sure they're shots from that relocation center. And of course, I know today a researcher would want to know the context of those photos, but at the time, the archivist didn't think that they were important. So even when you're trying your best to convey what something is about or what you think a researcher needs to know, you don't always get it right. And I think it's really important for anyone who participates in creating an archive to know too that you won't get it right either. You won't provide everything that everyone wants to know. You're just going to capture a story at one moment in time, and it's going to be different later. And I can say that based on my own interview research, I spent several months living with one of the women I had interviewed for my thesis and subsequent work. And I would just put the tape recorder on the table and let it run, and she would talk about things and I would ask questions. And so I've captured the same stories, probably a handful of the stories, maybe 10 times. And I can say that in every recording, there's a slightly different detail or a slightly different emphasis or some kind of emotional current that wasn't there before. And the same was true when I worked at Veterans History Project, listening to those oral histories. Sometimes we would have repeat oral history interviews with the same veteran. And in one story, they don't mention one anecdote at all. And in the next interview, it's incredibly important and brings them to tears. So it's important to recognize when you're looking at these sources or creating these sources, these stories, that they only are partial. They only tell one aspect, one moment, and that when you're trying to build a historical narrative out of them, you need to use as many as you can to try to get a sense of that broader story that's really there underneath all these pieces of evidence or created with all these pieces of evidence. So that's what I will say.
That's great, Sam. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot of correspondence among these presentations. I saw Melissa nodding at several parts of your narrative. So now we'll turn to our final panelist, Melissa Sivany, who is a science reporter.
Hi, it's great to be here. Yeah, these are fascinating talks. So yes, I'm the science journalist at KNEU, and I'm going to talk about something a little bit different because the main way I capture stories is through interviews. I go around and talk to people. That's sort of my job. So it's interesting. I've been a science communicator in one form or another for about 10 years or so now. But I came to it from the sciences. My undergraduate degree was in environmental science, and I was drawn to the sciences because I love facts and I love reading scientific papers and all of that hard data. That's what really compels me. So one thing I struggled with when I became a science journalist, and still struggle with, is learning this hard lesson, which is that facts don't actually matter all that much when your goal is to change people. And what I mean by change people is not necessarily change minds, but actually sort of change hearts, right? When you tell a story, what you want to do is change the way somebody looks at the world, right? They walk away looking at the world just a little bit different than they did before. Maybe they have a different idea of what something looks like from someone else's perspective, or maybe you've answered a question that they had in their mind, right? I'm not talking about big changes necessarily, but that's always the goal, right? You want to give them a story that they're going to carry away something from. And it turns out that facts don't really do that, which I really struggled with. There's a lot of good research behind this, because of course I look up the research, that shows that facts don't really change people. What changes people are stories. And so this was the hard lesson I had to learn, is that if I'm telling a story, it can't be about facts. It has to be about people. It's always about the people. So I tell a lot of stories that, at their essence are kind of a hard science story. I reported on the elk, for example, that Michael talked about earlier, and being relocated. I report climate change stories. I've spent time down in the biosphere too, for example, with scientists. But in all of the science that's going on, I always have to figure out, who are the people involved? Why is this a story really about people? And maybe that's as simple as a scientist being really, really excited to find something out. Or maybe it's something deeper than that. Maybe there's a culture story or an art story behind the science. And so this was a big learning curve for me, and I'm still working on it. But I think one thing it's important to keep in mind is that stories end up constructing our memory and our history, right? And you can think about this just in the context of like your own family stories. I was talking with my sisters the other day, and somehow we got on the topic of the earliest thing we could remember. And one of my sisters started telling this childhood story about playing at this rickety old swing set. And my oldest sister said, that's not a memory, that's a photograph that's hanging on the wall of our parents' house. Right? And we probably all have a memory like that turns out it's not really a memory, it's a story that our family tells. And so that's very powerful, that stories become our history, they become truth. It's also very dangerous, because think about the kind of people that get to tell their stories, right? Think about everybody who doesn't get to tell their story. And so I think this is the first lesson of storytelling, is to really think about who has the power to tell stories and who is being left out. At the height of the pandemic, in like maybe June or July, when Arizona was starting to receive a lot of national attention, I was getting really frustrated because I was reading, the Post and the Times, and finding that all of the stories about Arizona were set in Phoenix. Right? They were all set in Phoenix, and reporters were wandering around asking Phoenicians about how things were going. But as Lorenzo pointed out, the real story was happening on the Navajo Nation, which was outstripping New York City in these per capita cases. And that's where there were stories about lack of access to clean water and having to drive miles and miles to get to a hospital or to get to a doctor. That's where the real stories were happening. And it's only, I think, recently that those stories have started to be told on a national stage. So I think that's kind of the first lesson or tip, I guess, I want to leave you with is when you're going out and looking for stories, I know you're going to go out and be doing interviews, think about who doesn't get to tell their story, or which communities are being left out. And that could be because of race or gender, could be because of class, could be because of the job that they have. Are we telling enough stories about the essential workers who are checking people out at the grocery stores? It's hard to find these stories because they're by their nature sort of invisible to us. We don't often think about what we're not hearing. But I think that's a really important lesson to pull away, is to think about whose story isn't being told. And then I wanted to give you a few other sort of practical tips of things I've learned in the process of interviewing. When you're collecting stories from interviews, it's different every time, and so there aren't really any hard and fast rules. When I first started this job, I tended to really over prepare, and I would like research everything I could about the person I was going to interview and the topic, and I'd make a whole list of questions and type them up and print them out and bring them with me. And I discovered pretty fast that was not necessarily the best strategy. It's good to prepare a little bit, but when you get to the interview, and in the before times, you would maybe go to their house or go to their office, you've got to put all that stuff away, literally put it away and mentally put it away, and just talk to them like an actual human being, right? And I usually start with a really simple question like, will you just introduce yourself to me, right? And then you've got to listen to what they say next. I know this sounds really simple, but this is a skill that we do not practice in our society anymore, actually listening to people. And I really recommend you go out and practice, like go home today, and whoever, to your significant other or your roommate or your family, whoever you're close to, ask them, how was your day? And then listen to what they say, because it's amazing how often we don't actually do that. It takes work, it takes effort to actually concentrate on what they're saying. And then you ask the next question based on wherever that story started to go, right? And a really useful thing to do if you're struggling with this is to practice something called reflective listening. So I do this all the time in interviews, where I repeat back what they just told me. It sounds kind of dumb, but I get really good answers that way, because often they'll correct me. So reflective listening would be like, I heard you say that you were really angry about that. And they might come back and say, no, I wasn't angry, I was frightened. They might come back and correct you. And so that's a really useful skill in an interview, not only to keep yourself on track and listening to what they're saying, but to kind of pull out more answers from them. And then the third thing I wanted to leave you with is sort of how to ask storytelling type questions. I think, like Lorenzo talked about so beautifully, I think humans are storytelling creatures. We all, some level or another, know how to tell stories and want to tell stories. But in a formal setting with a stranger who probably has a tape recorder, it can be a little nerve-wracking, right? People might not be very comfortable telling their stories. And so how do you kind of get around that and start pulling those stories out of them? So storytelling questions you might ask, things like, where were you when? That's the classic one. Where were you when Pearl Harbor happened? Where were you when 9/11 happened? I have a friend who was a World War II vet, and just recently we were just chatting about something, and I asked, will you tell me what Flagstaff was like in the 1930s? And he looked at me and he said, there were wooden sidewalks and the town was segregated. And so that right there started a very interesting conversation about his experiences with segregation in Flagstaff in the 1930s. So where were you when questions are really wonderful. Ask about what they saw, about what they tasted, about what they smelled, right? Get those questions that will start them in a storytelling mode. Ask about objects. Samantha was talking about that, right? Ask them to bring out the photo albums and show a physical object to you. Ask how they feel about something. It took me a while to learn to do this because, again, I'm coming from that really analytical mindset, and it wasn't instinctive to me to ask how people feel. But I found that's really powerful. I was interviewing someone about the pandemic who was a funeral director in Tuba City, and I had called him to ask about some very technical legal question and didn't really know what I was going to get. And he started to talk about his experiences as a funeral director at the height of the pandemic, and was becoming very emotional. And I stopped and I said, this might be kind of obvious, but will you just tell me how you feel about this? And it was very powerful what he told me. You could look up the interview if you want. His name was Michael Begay. And it was one of the most powerful interviews I've done for the entire length of the pandemic. So yeah, stop and ask people how they feel. And then the final question I always ask, which I'll hand off to you, is I always end with, what else did you want to tell me? And there's almost always something, and often it's something I would have never thought to ask about. So that's a great concluding question to ask in the process of an interview. So I just wanted to share, those are sort of things that I've learned in the last 5 years that hopefully will be helpful for you as you go off and start collecting stories. And I don't know where I'm at with time, but I think I'll leave it right there.
That's wonderful, Melissa. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. I'd like to go ahead and open up for questions. We have a good half an hour left. What I'd like to do first is turn to any of the panelists to see if they have observations to make about one another, about the storytelling, the uses of stories that you've noticed, correspondences that you've noticed. So do any of the panelists first have observations to make?
Well, I'll just start. I'll say that archivists are wonderful. I'm married to one, but I also started out as a journalist when I was an undergraduate. So I sort of understand sort of how both of those feel, and it's sort of which verb tense you choose to use in your profession, I guess. So, you know, I'll leave it. I'll stop for right now. Let's somebody else go.
Lorenzo, Melissa, Sam, do you have any comments about the four takes on stories?
So something, oh, sorry. Something that something I've noticed is that a common problem that I have as an archivist, and that I'm sure others have run into when they're doing research, is that there's a hope for documentation that doesn't exist, or if it did exist, has not been saved. And so there's always a challenge when you're trying to tell a story, when you can't find that one key detail that you need to really make this story happen. And it's usually not because of any gross negligence on the part of anyone. It's just that many, many stories get lost. Which is why the work that Lorenzo describes of keeping stories and cultures, keeping stories going and keeping them intact is so important, no matter what form that takes, because it's really easy for stories to be lost and much harder to keep them.
Thanks, Sam. Go ahead, Lorenzo, you had something?
Yes, I really enjoyed all the presentations that, and I really liked Michael's presentation, you know, going back and collecting stories and some of the things that he has to go through. A lot of times when I lecture at NAU in my class, my students, and then when I go abroad to other universities to talk, I always have people tell me, are you writing a book? Do you have a book out? And I said, no, I'm not a writer. So then I think about that, and I think to myself, you know, I don't know where to get information and stuff like that. So it was really good to see some of his take on the research and how he was able to use the internet and stuff like that. I still don't really know how to use YouTube yet, but I'll figure it out. So, and, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Now,
I'm not even on Facebook.
that's okay. You're not missing anything.
Yeah, it's only because I don't know how to do that. Oh. Yes.
Joy, if I could just add, you know, I would just say to everybody that it's, you know, historians generally have always relied upon written documents. And I think one of the things that Lorenzo brought out was all of the material culture objects that are so important for understanding stories. And to look at things, I mentioned landscapes. You can learn a lot about reading landscapes, and to see landscapes described as the human organization of space. And you can learn a lot from landscapes and from photographs and from pictures and from music and all those other kinds of things. And I would encourage your students when they're out exploring pandemic stories to not only think about, you know, people and those things, but think about all those different things that can't tell. but maybe just, you know, a picture, a before and after picture. What did, you know, NAU football game look like during a regular season, and what does the Sky Dome look like this fall? You know, just thinking about the absence of things sometimes can be very telling.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mike. I teach an environmental humanities class, and one of the things we've been talking about in class is what has newly been appearing in our environment, and that is, you know, masks by the side of the road, disposable masks in opinions that, and it at first it was stunning, and now we're talking about how it's getting disturbingly common sight. So yeah, I think it's great to investigate material culture as well. Yeah. So questions, comments, go ahead and raise your hand, or just put something in the chat if you would like. What did you find valuable? What is making you think twice? What observations would you like to make? Questions?
I have a question for Lorenzo. I was just curious what kind of herb you guys were using.
I don't know the English names to most of them. There's several ingredients. I know the Navajo names, but one of them would be sage. But that's only one ingredient. And I wasn't able to make all of them because I noticed that when I started gathering, some of the herbs were not growing because it's probably because of the climate change, and some of them were grown in small patches. So I wasn't able to harvest enough of those. And these herbs are very fragile. So I never really explored the idea of, you know, looking up the English names to them. And to be quite frank, you know, I didn't really think that I was going to encounter a time when I would have to utilize that story to help other people. It's just never really occurred to me until you know, that virus came along. And my grandfather was saying that you know, that kind of thing is going to come again, and it has come before in our culture. And it's around, it's due right now, you know, it's probably going to come up pretty soon. So that's what he was saying. I didn't take it seriously, but you know, he was right. I just want to say something about what Michael just said about the land wanting to tell a story and stuff like that. A lot of our songs are tied to nature, like Mother Earth, Father Sky, the wind, the water, the thunder, you know, and the air, and on and on, the mountains, animals. To give you an example, to sing all the songs that relate to the mountain, it would take 4 nights to sing it all. And wind songs, the male wind song, you know, you're talking about a 5-day event. And then that's not even covering the female wind, you know, so that takes another 5 nights and 5 days. And it tells you how much knowledge we have about the events, you know, about the wind, the male and the female. So in our culture, everything has to be balanced. So we just can't learn about the wind, the male one, and disregard the female. We have to know about both of them. So as you can see, there's a lot of stories, and a lot of it is tied to nature, like I said. So the land, the rocks, the trees, the mountains, the animals, the plants, they all have a story to tell, and they all have a spirit. And the way we hang on to their story is through our songs. And so, you know, when you sing these songs, you know, it's a grandfather. Let me just use him. You know, 20 years ago, you know, 80 years ago, when he was the same thought that went through his mind would go through my mind, because the song tells a story, and the story would be going through his mind while he sings the song. And 1,000 years ago, somebody was singing the songs that I know, the same, he would get the same visual, the same thoughts pretty much, you know, going through his mind. So it's our connection to our ancestors. So it's, you know, like the way my father used to say, you know, my songs and my prayers and my ceremonies are like my mother and father. I go to them for everything. And one day you're going to regard it as such too. So my father and mothers are gone now. So I think of my songs, my prayers, and my ceremonies as my mother and my father, as my ancestors. So when I sing their song, I'm close to them and I'm connected to them. And it's almost like you're a living ancestor.
Thank you, Lorenzo. I think it's really striking too when you said at the beginning of your presentation that the songs and the stories are the healthcare system. I think that really resonates.
Yeah.
Resonated for many people in the audience. Yeah. Thank you. TJ has a question for Sam and or Melissa. Can you remember specific instances when you might have interviewed people you don't agree with or you think are biased? And how do you deal with that?
Sam, did you want to dive in or should I start?
I can tell an archival one that's really tricky if anyone has advice. So I mentioned I've been doing this long-term research project with some folks who I've interviewed extensively, and sometimes their memories contradict what their documents say. And it's very challenging to argue with the person about when an event in their own life happened based on their own documentation of their life. And I've found typically it's not, in that specific instance where I was trying to establish a date for when something was done. I had a letter that said it was done on one date. The person was adamant that it happened at a much later date. I just sort of let it go because it's about constructing a story out of the whole of it. But I think with other interviews, and I would be curious to hear Melissa's thoughts, it's the more active listening you can do, the more you can help the interview flow, even if you don't agree with that person or don't think their account of events is correct or whatever it may be. You can just shift it back onto gathering every detail you can from them about their version of it versus your opinion about that version.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree with that active listening is the answer. I mean, you know, in answer to your question of interviewing people who are biased, everybody's biased, right? Every interview I do is with a person who's biased, and guess what? So am I, because I'm a human being. It's really this myth that people are objective about anything. As a journalist, or in your case, as an interviewer or a storyteller of any kind, it's your job to kind of put aside your own ideas and figure out what the story is that needs to be told. I mean, your loyalty is to the larger truth, right? And so with these complex issues where there's people coming from all different directions, you've got to tell that whole story. And the way to do that is just what Sam said, is to ask questions and then to listen, to just listen without judgment and take in the story. I'll give you kind of a funny example. So the buffalo herd at the north rim of the Grand Canyon is an incredibly controversial issue that I did a story on a little while ago. And I interviewed a whole bunch of different people from different sides who all had really different ideas about what to do with these buffalo or bison. And what was interesting is you could tell what their perspective is just by what they called it, right? Some people would talk about these buffalo or these American bison as these beautiful, majestic animals at the Grand Canyon. And some people would call them catalo or beefalo and talk about how they'd interbred with cows, and they were basically just cows trampling everything at the Grand Canyon, and they needed to be shot, basically. So there were all these different perspectives on that story. And, you know, through the process of listening and you know, I formed my own opinion, but that was irrelevant, right? I could set that aside and just ask the questions about why people felt the way they did about these animals. Why was it stirring up so much passion? I was always careful to ask the other side, right? Say, well, some people feel like they should be protected. Some people feel like they should be removed. How would you respond to those people? It wasn't about me or my opinion. It was just about responding to all of the different ideas. And I tried, it was a tough story. I had like 3.5 minutes at the end of the day to do this radio story, but I tried to just capture as much as I could from all of those perspectives and get them all in the story, because in the end, they're all valid. It's all part of the story. So I don't know if that helps or not, but definitely what Sam said, just listen as hard as you can, take it all in. And yeah, set your own ideas about it aside. So.
Thank you. What else? I am curious, and something Lorenzo said sort of sparked this, and then it kind of goes to also to what Melissa was saying earlier about coming from a science background. So one of the things I do is called ecological criticism. So I look at how the natural world is represented in different cultural products, mainly in literature. And eco-criticism has just lately taken this material turn where eco-critics are really interested in non-human agency. And it struck me when Lorenzo was saying, you know, everything has a story to tell, the rocks, the trees, you know, and recently in science and social science, people are saying, oh, you know, trees have agency. They travel, they take care of their young, they warn each other of incoming infections, you know, and things like that. And, you know, there's been all sorts of scientific studies to say that, okay, trees have agency. And what other non-human life, you know, has agency? And I just think it's funny and it's ironic that a lot of these ideas have powerful resonance in indigenous and Aboriginal cultures, and all of a sudden scientists are like, oh, we just discovered this idea that, you know, trees have agency. And so I'm really curious about these different kinds of storytelling that we do. We tell cultural stories, we tell scientific stories, right? We tell, I mean, what other kinds of stories? We tell stories, rhetorical stories to persuade someone of something. So I don't know if I really have a question, but more of a comment, like a comment that there's so many different ways to get at the same thing, I guess.
Can I say something to that?
Please.
It's interesting that you were thinking about it in that way. You know, for us, my lectures are my class is 2.5 hours long, you know, once a week. And it seems like I'm just barely getting started, then time's over. Gotten to the point where I don't even give restroom breaks no more. Let's go right through. So there's a lot of things, you know, that I can tell, but the thing is, it's that the misunderstanding is you know, where I see a lot of problem. To us, we have some words that we don't have no translation in English. So English becomes kind of like a poor language to describe the spiritual significance of how we see things and how we view the world. So, and it's very hard to make sense. It's very hard to talk about it because sometimes, in a way, it sounds downright corny sometimes, you know. But the worldview that we have is requires some basic foundation of understanding. So I spend most of my time, my first semester of teaching, just laying the foundation for the students so they can begin to understand what it is that I'm talking about. So, and it takes a lot of work. I don't expect anybody to understand fully, from my perspective of what I'm talking about. So that the way we see things, the way we understand things, basically really hasn't changed for a long time. But now in this century, we're beginning to see changes because a lot of our young people don't understand the language no more, and so therefore they don't see the world as I see it. The understanding that I have, they don't see it in that way. So, but back to nature, the wind, the water, everything in nature to me has a service to provide. There's just not the wind, there's just not the water, there's just not the mountain. I use them to heal people. People come to me and I read their energy within their aura and tell them of what imbalance they have to the wind, to the water, to the animals, to the plants, or some part of nature, even to the rocks, to the plants. And then my mission becomes realigning them with that particular part of nature so that we can allow the healing energy to begin to flow. So all the ceremonies that we have is there only to realign ourselves with nature. We don't think in terms of healing, although that's a word that I have to use because I'm talking English. And in our own language, it's more like we use the word to fix it. That's how we use it. So, but, if I say that to fix it, they're going to say, fix what? Well, the imbalance. But then when you do that, then healing takes place. So there's a lot more, to study the wind way would take a lifetime to study in our culture. And I never met a man that's been able to master both the male and the female way of any part of nature. So it's a lifetime of study. And I haven't even begun to travel down that path yet, all the time that I've been studying underneath my elders.
I have a question for, I think, Melissa, because you somewhat touched upon it. But as far as somewhat in recent times, we've had a lot of problems with fake news going around. And one of the things that I've constantly heard that you should do to combat fake news is fact check and try to find the facts. But as you somewhat touched on, if the facts don't properly tell the story and also the facts can't properly be unbiased, is that really an accurate way to combat false information? And what would you kind of suggest as an alternative to that?
Sorry, I'm muted. I was saying that I think that's above my pay grade. That's such a big question. I wish I had the answer for you, and I don't. Of course, we have to fact check things. That is part of being a journalist, is being accurate and having the facts correct. So that has to be done. And there's some interesting research that shows when there's misinformation floating around, more important than fact checking it is just replacing it with the correct information, because repeating the wrong information can be just as bad as having wrong information around. If that wasn't very clear, but it's important to replace wrong information with accurate information. So all of that is part of my job. The fact that you touched on that is clearly not enough, which we know from research, that's clearly not enough. But what is better? I don't think I know the answer to that question. I'm kind of just trying to do the best I can to tell the stories that aren't being told, to make sure people's voices are being heard, who maybe otherwise wouldn't be heard. And I'm focusing on that. I don't think I'm going to try to think too hard about solving these larger issues that are happening with misinformation and wrong information floating around, because it would be hard to do my job, honestly, if I focused too hard on that. So I'm not really answering your question. Maybe somebody else can jump in with a bigger idea, or maybe somebody in the audience has has a way to solve this, because I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Hi, am I heard? Am I audible?
Yeah, actually, if I could, I'll take a little bit of a shot at this. And I think this is one of the interesting things with social media and everything today, because the internet has made access to mass audiences available to everybody. And with an Instagram account or a Facebook account, you can reach out to lots of people. When I was your age, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, the only way anything that I got sent out that way was through some kind of a media and some kind of an editor. And that just isn't, I mean, that's just sort of, I think one of the great things about all of that today is that everybody has access. At the same time, there is little editing. Oftentimes there's no, when historians write, we have levels of things. If you give a presentation to the public, that's a certain level, but if you get peer reviewed, that's a harder issue, and that means more, because someone who is knowledgeable about the work is reviewing. I mean, you wouldn't want to go take a vaccine that hasn't been peer reviewed, would you? Probably not. And I think that's one of the really interesting things of this age, is that we love the democratization of access. But with that comes responsibility and issues of fake news and things like that. So I don't have an answer other than, historians are good at reflecting and deflecting things back to other people. Joya, you haven't said much today. What do you think about all that?
Thank you, Mike. Ryan, did you have something to say earlier? I saw you were unmuting.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, little.
I'll just have to talk. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just gonna have to talk like this. So maybe to add on to it is during I guess you could. I think it was during the Cold War. I've watched documentaries on it. I've also heard people talk about it, which is disinformation, and it could be relevant now. It's just something that to throw out there, I guess, in the sense of like the same ideas as to be skeptical of just about anything, really. In part, sometimes stuff seems obviously misinformation, and other times disinformation was a thing that the Soviets did. They would plant seeds and then retract them and plant seeds in different countries, and then retract them and plant seeds in different countries and retract them, basically in a nutshell. And then a couple years later or 10 years later, they would do it all over again. And then when somebody would point at and say, no, that's the Soviet doing it, they would go and research it and find out, oh, some other country was reporting on this. And then they would find this trail that, oh, this must be true because it's going back in time, when in reality they were just planting seeds along the way. And that's just one really small part of it. And one would think that in this day and age of information, that it would make things easier to research, but it also makes things easier to just throw things at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think it also speaks to the compelling nature of stories, right? I mean, stories are how we communicate, stories are how we transmit meaning, right? And I do know that there is a strategy. I live with a person who studies media and marketing, and there is a strategy in order to spread misinformation that's not spreading false stories, but just deluging the audience with stories. There's so much information and none of it is prioritized. We're just deluged. and unable to process what stories are important and what's not. And I know there's a term for it, and I can't think of it now, but I think you bring up at a really important point, you know, misinformation, disinformation, being deluged with information. The historian Yuval Harari, maybe some of you have looked at his book called Sapiens, and one of the things he argues in the very opening chapters of his book is that one of the defining features that made humans different is because we were able to tell stories to each other about what was valuable, right? And then we were able to communicate that to each other and thus able to make group decisions, right? And then of course, you know, we get competing stories, and so our stories are coming under, you know, differing values. But Harari makes this point that this is what sort of differentiates us among, you know, other Earth others, that we are telling stories to one another about what we decide to value as a group. And we migrate that way, or we follow this animal, or we choose this stone, or, you know, this river. So his whole notion about how we evolved as a species has to do with how we told stories to one another. So we have time for one or two more questions or comments or observations. There was a good stuff going on in the chat. Thank you, Lena. How do you interview someone who isn't talking much or doesn't seemingly have much to say? And Sam and Melissa had some really good advice for you. And Donnell too. Thank you, Dr. Rui.
Simsha has a good question in the chat.
Which is how to know if you've done enough research. And I really hope Michael and Melissa can answer this one, because I feel like I'm not good at cutting myself off.
Me neither. I know I'm done with my research because my editor says that the story's due tomorrow, so stop.
And I would just add, you know, students are always asking, you know, when is enough? And the hard thing now is everything is accessible. Mm-hmm. And so there's so much more accessible, but at some point you have to get your story into the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough to get it out there. So I was going to relate one quick story about, I had a friend who was a filmmaker at my first job in Idaho, and he had this videotape and he was interviewing a guy for a documentary, and he started talking to him and he was filming him, and the guy wouldn't talk. And he was the talking head for this documentary about the gold rush, and the guy was an expert and he wouldn't talk. And he said, "Can I get you anything?" And he said, "How about a beer?" And he went out and he was shocked. He went out and got a 6-pack of beer, and he gave me a copy of this videotape. And you'll see this videotape, the glass will be full. And then it'll be empty. And then it'll be full. And then it'll be empty. And it'll be full. And he drank a 6-pack of beer and became very animated in his talking about the gold rush by the end of it. It was great footage. I don't encourage you to use beer, but I encourage you to make the person comfortable. And I think if you make them comfortable, you know, go for a walk, turn the tape or turn the audio off for a little bit, or as people have said, you know, talk about an object or a picture or a family member, make them comfortable, and they'll start talking.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. And then to sort of round us off, there's some good related questions here. How do you pick a topic for your storytelling? How do you make a topic interesting if it's a particularly niche or dry topic? And how do you get others interested in your story? So related questions there.
I think my answer for all three of those things is actually the same. Be insatiably curious about whatever it is. Anything you're curious about becomes more and more interesting the more you dig into it. And I think if your curiosity I mean, that's going to drive you to ask the right questions and to keep digging deeper. And if you're curious, and passionate about it, I think that that shines through, and that makes other people curious as well. So.
Thanks, Melissa.
I always tell students, find something that has attention to it. Find something that you have an assumption about one thing, but you know something else about it.
That's great advice. Yeah, yeah. So I'll invite our panelists if they have any closing words. Thank you very, 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 very much for your time. We're right at 7 o'clock. So we'll close up and then take a quick break and move on to our breakout classes at 7:10. But by way of closing, I'll just invite any of the four of you to send us off with any closing comments.
All right, I'll dive in. Just thank you for these wonderful questions, and I always feel heartened. I know it's such a difficult time in a lot of different ways for everybody, but I always feel heartened to be in a group of people who are just as excited about stories as I am. So this was a lot of fun and encouraging for me. So thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for being here.
I just want to say thank you to you for inviting me to this session. And it's always good to learn, from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And I did learn things from the presenters and also some of the students. Thank you very much. You be careful out there and be safe.
You too, Lorenzo. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sam or Mike? Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it as well. And good luck to all of you. And if I'm available, if anybody needs any further help or has a question for me, you can always email me. I'm in the history department.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would say thank you too. And I would also say that when you're conducting your interviews and wondering if anyone will ever find it interesting or find something valuable, you just have to wait for the right researcher. Someone's going to find your source and find a story in it that you can't even imagine right now. And I think that's what I see again and again every day when people come in to use these materials.
Yeah.
So you're doing the future a favor.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. And I'll just say thanks to the Arizona Humanities who supported this evening with a grant. So the Arizona Humanities finds stories important and we're supporting as well. So that's good to know. So we will go ahead and take a break now and reconvene with our students at 7:10. Thank you to our community audience and thank you again to our panelists. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.